Please join me in welcoming the director, Min Sook Lee. Who else is up here with us?
Maybe I can introduce some of the crew and my team. Maggie, I'm going to put this on the floor, okay? Thanks for the flowers, so sweet. Thanks, Kelly. I'd like to introduce some of the people who were working with me on this film over the years. Shada Shavanas, who's the producer of the National Film Board. Ira Singh, cinematographer. Young Zong, the editor. And Andrew Young-Hoon Lee, who's the composer of the music.
I would love to start out by asking you some questions, and then before I turn it open to the audience with their questions about the film, how long have you had this idea to document this journey of yours, and how long did it take to come together?
The film is a film that has been inside of me for most of my life. Having the opportunity to make a film about this was an incredible privilege. And I think that for much of my life I knew I longed to tell the story, but I didn't think I had the capacity. I didn't think I had the skills, but I also didn't know that I would have the emotional kind of fortitude to come near the story. It's not a story, it's my life. But I knew I wanted to find some way at some point, and it was one of those, as a filmmaker, this is my 9th film, so it's taken me a long time to feel like I can approach it. But as I said in the beginning, in many ways I think COVID did something to a lot of us. It made choices seem really stark. It redefined what priorities were, and it reminded you that the clock is ticking. And that was, I think, an urgent moment for me when I realized I was looking at my father and I thought, oh, he's almost 90 and he's not going to be around much longer. That became quite real during COVID, like for many of you. And I felt such grief, and I didn't know what that grief was. And as I started to think about it, I realized it was the grief that I knew. If he died, then she would die permanently, forever, in a way that I wouldn't be able to ever access. He had so many stories I wanted to hear. And that's kind of what pushed the story into something more than this sort of feeling or longing or a need inside of me, into something that I felt, oh, I think I better do this now. Yeah.
What were, I imagine, there were many challenges on emotional level, all sorts of things. I'm wondering if you can tell us what were just some of the challenges in telling the story.
I think a big part of coming close to family stories that are not happy stories, that make you feel a little bit ashamed of your own family story, that you're coming close to stigma, you're coming close to something that is so painful. I think a big part of telling family stories is to ask yourself, well, why are you doing this? What's the purpose of this? And I had to remind myself as I worked on this project that my story is not singular, that there are many people who have experienced lives like my mother's life, who grew up in families like mine, And so often, our stories aren't told, and I thought a lot about erasure and silences, memory, how memory becomes so unstable to make you even doubt yourself. You know what happened, but you ask yourself, what did that happen? And it made me think about the purpose of lies and silences. Growing up in a family in which I had many questionable truths as I grew up, it really made me doubt myself along the way, even just as I was telling this story. And I think there's a part of me that feels I have this compulsion to understand a truth of some sort, but also just a resignation that sometimes the truth can't ever be fully known. So I think that's one of the challenges of making this film, just this coming to the realization that I was looking for a few truths and there would never be any kind of neat closure. But I still thought telling the story, I think what fortified me in telling the story was thinking about a collective story, thinking about how so many of our personal stories, they're not personal, they're deeply political. They're like our lives are shaped by the currents of the times. And what we see in the headlines when we see people carry out atrocities or are agents of a state that is a fascist dictatorship, when we hear about those activities, I think we don't often think about what happens at home. And that violence that happens in the public sphere takes up space in the private families, in our kitchens and bedrooms. And I thought a lot about that. I think that was one of the reasons I had a conviction that this was a story that was important to tell.
Absolutely. I'd like to turn it over to Iris. If you could talk about the tone and how you went from, interiors in Toronto to South Korea, and what sort of discussions did you have with Vinsuk about what you wanted, how you both wanted to present the film?
Well, just to credit the other cinematographers who worked on the film, there were several, but I was on board from the beginning, and we had discussions at the beginning about how this film, what I remember, is very much a conversation with the past. And so we treated the interview with your father and modern day verite as we normally would, but we also shot in Super 8 to sort of bring the past forward in the present as well. And so there's that sort of conversation with the material too. And between Toronto and Korea, I think we approached Korea with a little bit more richness and depth as a place that maybe your mother had a little bit more agency. I'm not sure, but maybe that's something I sort of kept in mind. As well as we use different perspectives in different moments too. So there's sort of our gaze, but then there's this spectral gaze that you talked about as well. That there's this other worldly presence that was important to you to also include as part of reality, I guess. And I think midway through the process, we sort of discovered or identified that was maybe your mother's presence, and that we could embody and think about it that way. So the Super 8 was more, I think it was more present in the more traditional ritualistic moments, and so we incorporated that sort of floatiness into that. So we put a Super 8 camera on a gimbal, and that was challenging.
Wondering if there's any questions from the audience? Otherwise, I can keep going. All the way at the back.
That's me. Hi, Vinsuk, it's Yael, way up here. We've spoken a lot about the link between the personal and the political and how these are linked, and you just mentioned that. But when I watched it this time, it really felt to me like it's a document of justice. That there's something where that reckoning would not have happened had you not embarked on this journey. Does that resonate for you?
Absolutely. It's really interesting because when you make a film like this, it feels like a very intimate process. So Young and I have been in the edit suite for about a year together, like working with this material, thinking about the story that we're building. And it's so interesting. It is a real privilege to have the world premiere with you. And it's a completion of a sort, an understanding of the film differently once you've seen it and then you're telling me the things that you're seeing. So that's really interesting, Yael, because I agree. I think that this film, I could never have had those conversations with my father without the film. The film has a kind of a barricade. It's an armature. It provided me a kind of a security, and because I've worked in film for a while, I'm familiar and I like the control, you know, of having a crew and having a camera and being able to set up the scenes the way I want. And I think that those conversations I had with my father were much too scary to ever have had. And I could never have had them without a witness as well. And so in some ways, the crew was my witness. So the film practice here created the conversations, or the catalyst for conversations that needed to be had. So it's a really interesting observation you're making there, Yael. And you know, I had to show the film to my father before we locked picture, because I knew that we couldn't, and it was probably scarier a screening than this one is. When I think about it. He came to the film board, and Shonda and Young and I were there, and we showed him the film. And it was interesting to me. He said, the two things I remember, he said, one was, he said, well, he had a quibble about the way in which his Army service was presented. He wanted to correct some facts. But the other thing that he said to me was, I didn't know it meant so much to you. And I found that really, really fascinating, because we all live our lives in which we're sort of center, and our perspective and our reality dominates. And he's carried on for almost 90 years with a certain grandiosity. And my mother was just one of other women in his life. And sometimes he would say to me, why are you making this film? She wasn't that interesting. She wasn't that important. Like, she was just a regular person. And so part of like the film itself is a testimony to lives that would have been erased, to lives that would have been disappeared from the archive, from public memory. And just, it made me understand, like, there's death, but then there's social death. There's a way in which if you are permanently expunged from public memory, then it's like you never mattered, you never existed. And I appreciated and understood why, when we look at situations of dominance and oppression, it is so important for perpetrators to control the storytelling, to make sure that their narrative holds still. And throughout making this, I thought a lot about lies and erasures and silences, and what do they uphold? And how are they in fact enforcements of power and silencing, distortion of truth, silencing of people who are oppressed? So I was often thinking about that relationship between the personal and the political. And when I was shooting in Gwangju, how many of you remember the Gwangju uprising in some way? And curious about how that, hands up those who knew about the Gwangju uprising. So for me growing up, that was a very important moment, because that was the birth of democracy in Korea. And Korea had a series of dictatorships, and it was in Gwangju when the students and the farmers and bus drivers, market people came together to fight a dictator and oppose martial law. And the massacre of the protesters would possibly have never been known if there wasn't footage and if journalists didn't sneak in. And some of the footage you see in the film, some of that footage was captured by Hinspeter, who was a journalist who snuck in the back road when no media was allowed. And I think about that as so precious, because the purpose of destroying that footage was to expunge memory and to re-narrate something. And as Zora Neale Hurston often said, she said, you know, if you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and they'll say you enjoyed it. And so to me, I was often thinking about my mother's pain and thinking about ensuring that there was some way in which to speak about her life beyond what my father's story was, but also what the official story was. Because when I looked at the coroner's report, it just seemed so awful to me to assign her that. It was really horrifying to look at that and to think, well, that would be the dominant record here. And I remember being in Gwangju. I know this is a long answer, but it's the final part. I remember shooting in Gwangju. And Gwangju's never forgotten its role in bringing democracy to Korea. After the 1980 massacre, finally in 88, the dictatorship was overthrown. But it started in Gwangju, and it was the birthplace of democracy. And I was there in 24 shooting, and I was visiting the memorial in Gwangju, the memorial to the uprising, and to those who were killed, and to democracy. And there's this annual prize, it's the Hinspiter Prize. They honor the journalist who brought the footage of Gwangju to the world. And in 2024, two of the winners of the prize who were recognized by the Gwangju democracy movement were Palestinian journalists. Who were unwavering in their commitment to ensure that what was happening in the genocide in Gaza was told. And they had a commitment to the story and a bravery that was recognized by the Gwangju democracy movement. And I held that as I made this film, thinking about the relationship between the personal and then the public. So, I think, you know, the film itself, I wanted to make sure it was never just a personal film. I wanted to think about that relationship between what happens in your personal life and what happens in the public sphere. And, you know, when we were cutting, Yoon Suk-yeol tried to bring back a dictatorship and institute martial law in Korea, just as we were finishing the cut. And I remember Young and I were watching the footage of what was going on in Korea. We're astonished. But what was incredible was that Koreans refused to go back. They pushed back and they resisted and they said, no, we're never going back to that dictatorship. And that was a moment of hope.
Hands up there. Go.
Hi, amazing film. I was wondering if you and your editor talk a bit about how you decided which part of the translator role and conversation to keep, because I find that very, very interesting. At some point, us as audience have an advantage point because we understand what your father says immediately and you don't. You have to wait for the translator. But we understand everything, and there are parts that we only read the subtitles, there are parts that we read the subtitles, hear how it has been translated. And at the end, there's that scene which looks like a therapy, like the translator becomes a witness, like your father is saying those very, very hard stuff, and it seems like the translator is a witness for you to say, like, can you hear this? Can you hear how, like, are these sentences real? Because I feel like, I don't know, I find the translator role in your film very, very important. And I wonder how you chose to keep which parts and which parts.
Thanks, great question. I'm gonna ask Young to start answering that one, and I can add.
First of all, I want to acknowledge our translator, Haeyeon, who's here. Also, Daniel, I don't know if he's here. Yeah, I think it was really important to include Haeyeon and also other translator in the conversation because of this like triangulated nature of the conversation and how Min-suk, as much as she wants to like get to the truth, she always has to go through this like mediator, and that barrier of truth is always has to go through that. I think it was important to for us to kind of experience that frustration as well. But yeah, I think you made a really important point about bearing with us also, and I think I believe Haeyeon really provided that comfort and emotional support, and I think it was important that her presence was really appreciated and really needed.
And maybe just to add to that, I think the experience of not having access to your mother tongue is very common here in this country in particular. So many of us grow up not able to have substantive conversations with our parents because we don't speak the language of home. And that creates an alienation and a distance that's quite challenging. I think the title of the film spoke to so much of that, the loss of language, the loss of words and like, just the inability to share the kind of intimacy that you think might be there for your family relations, but I've always been really sad actually that I can have very deep, intimate conversations and share lots of things with total strangers, like the cashier at the grocery store, you know, but not with my father or, you know, and to not have access to language is a real muting and is a flattening of the primary relationship. Yeah, I agree with you. Haeyeon and Subin and Samuel, who are the translators, carried a lot of emotional labor, as well as, it's not just pure, you know, transactional, technical translation. There was so much more. And I think it speaks to the power of language, what it holds for us. It was very difficult work.
I feel like I could listen to you speak for a very long time. We are out of time, unfortunately. Do you have, is that okay? And I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you so much. This is really, really fascinating conversation.